Grandma called on a Tuesday morning. For weeks after my sister's engagement party, the one my parents rented a vineyard venue for, the one with a string quartet and a photo booth and 150 guests, and not one seat for me. Her voice was the voice she used when she'd already made up her mind about something and just needed me to catch up. "Come to the house," she said. "Friday, by yourself, and don't tell your mother you're coming." I was standing in a stockroom at the time, counting inventory boxes with a scanner gun in my hand. And I set it down on a shelf so slowly you'd have thought it was made of glass. Welcome back to her side of the story, for every woman who held it together alone. If tonight's story sounds like something you've lived, you already know why you're here. Type "I know that feeling" in the comments before we even get started, because I promise you, by the end of this one, you'll mean it more than you do right now. My name is Nora, I'm 33 years old, and for 11 years I've worked as a bookkeeper for a chain of hardware stores, headquartered to towns over from where I grew up. I balance other people's numbers for a living: payroll, vendor invoices, the quiet arithmetic that keeps a business standing upright without anyone noticing the work underneath it. I learned to love numbers from my grandmother, a woman named Doris Whitlock, who spent 34 years behind the counter, and then behind the manager's desk of a small community bank in the town where I still live. Doris had hands roughened from decades of counting bills, and a memory for figures that outlasted every calculator she ever owned. She used to say that numbers don't lie, but people do, and the two of those things live in the same room more often than anybody wants to admit. My mother, Carol, ran a different kind of household, not a bank, not a ledger, but something that functioned the same way. There was an account that got funded, and an account that didn't. And by the time I was old enough to understand the difference, I already knew which one I was. My sister Paige is 3 years younger than me, and she came into the world needing things loudly. She cried until someone came. She asked until someone said yes. I was the opposite kind of daughter, the kind who packed her own lunch by age 9, filled out her own permission slips by 12. And got called so easy by relatives the way you'd compliment a car that never breaks down. Easy isn't a compliment. It's a description of someone nobody thinks they need to check on. I don't say any of this to villainize my mother. She raised 2 daughters and worked full-time at a dental office, answering phones and juggling insurance claims. And she did what a lot of tired parents do. She gave her attention to the child who made noise about needing it. Paige was the noise. I was the silence. And my grandmother, who had spent her whole career noticing which numbers didn't add up, noticed that too. She saw me standing at the edge of family photos while Paige stood at the center. She saw me drive myself to my college orientation because both my parents had a conflict. She never said anything about it directly, not for years. She just watched, the way a woman who spent 3 decades catching embezzlement and bounced checks learns to watch. And somewhere in that watching, she started keeping records of her own. I didn't know that yet. Not on the Tuesday she called. I only knew that something in her voice had shifted, and that my grandmother did not use the word Friday the way other people used it. When Doris Whitlock said a day and a time, she meant it the way she meant a closing balance. Let me give you the numbers first, because numbers are the language my grandmother taught me to trust, and because they explain more than any speech I could give you about how it felt. At my high school graduation, my mother took 2 photographs. I know because I counted the flash going off, twice, and then nothing. My father, Richard, ran a small insurance agency in town. The kind of business where he knew every client's name and every client's premium by heart. And on the night of my graduation, he arrived 40 minutes late and left before they called my row because a client had an emergency. 4 years later, at Paige's graduation, my parents hired an actual event photographer. 206 images. Uploaded that same week to a shared photo album I only found because Paige tagged me in a comment by mistake. They rented a private room at the steakhouse downtown for 40 people. I was there. I sat between my cousin Dana and my father's business partner, and I clapped when they gave the toast, and I drove myself home while the rest of the family went out for drinks. When I needed my father's signature on a co-sign form for my first apartment, he told me he'd get to it. He forgot twice. I lost the unit and moved into a smaller one across town, alone, With a security deposit I paid from tips I'd saved working weekends at a diner through my last year of community college. When Paige wanted to attend a 3-week event planning intensive in another state, my father drove her there himself. An 8-hour trip. Stayed in a hotel nearby for the first 2 nights to make sure she settled in, and called her every evening for the rest of the program. I didn't keep a tally, not consciously. But somewhere in me, the way my grandmother kept receipts in unlabeled folders, I was keeping one too. The morning I found out about Paige's engagement party, I found out the way you find out about most things you weren't supposed to know, through somebody else's phone. My cousin Dana had posted a story. String lights strung across a vineyard patio. A 3-tier cake with sugar flowers. A banner with Paige's name and her fiancé's name stitched together in gold foil letters. 150 faces in that backyard, and I recognized most of them. My mother's co-workers, my father's clients, cousins from both sides of the family. Paige's whole college friend group. 150 people, and none of them called to tell me it was happening. I stood in my kitchen and watched that story on a loop for longer than I want to admit. Then I did something my grandmother would have understood without me explaining it. I drove to the drugstore, picked out a card with a watercolor bouquet on the front, and wrote inside it, standing at the counter with a pen that kept skipping. I told Paige I was happy for her. I told her I remembered when she was 7, and I taught her to ride a bike in the church parking lot, running alongside her until my lungs burned, refusing to let go even after she told me to. I told her congratulations, and I signed it, Love, Nora. And I mailed it along with a gift card to a home goods store, more than I usually spend on anyone. Because Paige and her fiancé were furnishing a new place together, and I thought it might help. My mother called 2 days later. "That was thoughtful of you, honey," she said. In the background I could hear music, some kind of leftover playlist still running somewhere in the house. You know how these things go. The venue had a strict head count, 150 people. And the venue couldn't stretch to 151. "I'm glad she liked the card, Mom," I said, and I hung up. And I went back to reconciling a vendor invoice that was $11 off. Because $11 off is a problem you can actually solve. For weeks passed. 4 weeks of alarms and spreadsheets and grocery runs and a golden retriever named Biscuit, who needed his evening walk, rain or shine. The kind of rhythm that belongs to a life nobody thinks to interrupt. Because nobody imagines there's anything underneath it worth interrupting for. Then, on a Tuesday, my phone lit up on my desk at work, and the screen said Grandma Doris. That alone was unusual. My grandmother and I talked, but usually in relay. She'd mention something to my Aunt Denise. Denise would mention it to my mother, and I'd hear a secondhand, 3 days late version with half the details missing. Direct calls from Doris happened twice a year, on Christmas and my birthday. And even those had gotten shorter since her hip surgery. This was a Tuesday in September. Not a holiday. Not anything. I answered with the scanner gun still in my other hand. "Come to the house," she said. No greeting first, just the instruction, clean as a closing entry. "Friday, by yourself. And don't tell your mother you're coming." 40 seconds. I checked my call log later, because that's the kind of person I am. The kind who checks, the kind who keeps the receipt even when nobody asked her to. I called her back that evening. No answer. I texted, "Everything okay?" She replied 11 minutes later, in complete sentences with proper punctuation, the way she always wrote. "Friday, 10 o'clock. Bring nothing?" I drove home that night trying to talk myself into ordinary explanations. Maybe she wanted help moving furniture. Maybe there was a doctor's appointment she needed a ride to. But my grandmother didn't tell me to keep quilts a secret from my mother. She didn't say don't tell your mother about doctor's appointments. She said it about things that mattered, and in Doris Whitlock's world, the things that mattered always came with a number attached. I baked a batch of her oatmeal molasses cookies that Thursday night, the recipe written in her own hand on an index card gone soft at the corners. And I drove to her house Friday morning with the tin on the passenger seat and a feeling in my chest like the moment right before you open a bill. You already suspect is bad. If any part of this is landing somewhere familiar for you, if you've ever been the daughter who got left off a list, hit that subscribe button before we go any further. Because these stories don't stop coming, and neither should you. My grandmother's house sat at the end of a quiet cul-de-sac, a small brick ranch she and my grandfather bought the year they got married, painted the same pale yellow it had been since I was a child. Hydrangeas lined the front walk. My grandfather planted them the spring before he passed, and they'd come back thicker every year since. Stubborn in a way that felt almost intentional. She was on the porch when I pulled in, a cardigan buttoned to her throat despite the mild morning. And on her lap sat a thick manila envelope with a metal clasp. The kind you buy at an office supply store, not the kind that arrives in the mail. You brought cookies, she said. I told you to bring nothing. I know what you told me. Eat one anyway. She did. Slowly, the way she did everything, and then she nodded, toward the hallway behind her. Inside, back bedroom. The back bedroom smelled like cedar, and the lavender sachets she kept in every drawer. The bed was made with hospital corners, a habit my grandfather brought home from his time in the army, and never let go of. And Doris had kept the habit alive long after he stopped being the one to make the bed himself. Laid across the quilt in a neat row, like evidence set out for a hearing, were 3 folders, each labeled in her small, careful handwriting. She sat on the edge of the bed and patted the space beside her. I sat. Your grandfather loved you, she said. Not in the past tense people use at funerals. Present tense, like he was still in the next room. More than he let most people see. And your father changed what your grandfather left for you. I didn't move. I have proof, she said, and she opened the clasp on the envelope in her lap. Inside were 2 photocopied documents, both sharp and clean. My grandmother had bought a printer years ago and maintained it the way some people maintain a car, and she'd made these copies herself. This, she said, laying the first sheet on the quilt, is the will your grandfather wrote with a lawyer named Ed Marsh, back in 2011. 3 years before he died, I remembered Ed. He'd been at the funeral, an old friend of my grandfather's from the Rotary Club, wearing a tie 2 inches too short and crying quietly in the parking lot afterward. This, she said, setting the second sheet beside it, is the will your father filed with the county after your grandfather passed. Prepared by a different attorney. Your grandfather never saw this version in his life. I picked up the first document. My grandfather's handwriting sat in the margin near the section on asset distribution, in blue ink. Shaky but legible, the handwriting of a man who'd spent 40 years as a contractor and held a pen, the way he held a hammer. Next to the clause about the primary beneficiary, he'd written, for Nora, who never asks for a thing. The original will left the majority of his estate to me, the house on Cedar Ridge Road he'd bought as a rental property. 31 acres of undeveloped land out past the county line, and a credit union savings account holding just over $160,000, built up across 4 decades of steady work. My father was set to receive a smaller share, and the rest went into a trust for future grandchildren. The second will split things differently. 55% to Richard Whitlock, 25% to Paige Whitlock, 20% to me, held in a trust managed by my father. I had never received a statement, a phone call, a single dollar from that supposed trust. Nothing. I read both documents 3 times. Bookkeeping teaches you to look at 2 sets of numbers and find the one that doesn't reconcile. Does Dad know you have this? I asked. Not yet, she said, and she wasn't finished. She opened the second folder. Credit union statements for the savings account my grandfather had left the balance at the time of his death, just over $160,000, highlighted in yellow marker at every withdrawal, starting 4 months after the funeral. 5,000 here, 9,000 there. A lump withdrawal of 19,000 in the spring of 2016. By that fall, the account sat at 0. Every withdrawal bore a single signature. Richard Whitlock. Behind the statements sat a stack of printed emails between my father and a financial advisor I'd never heard of, with subject lines like restructuring Q3 and property liquidation timeline. The language was careful, almost calm, the way people write when they already know they're documenting something they'll regret. My father had put the money into a strip mall development that collapsed 18 months later when the anchor tenant pulled out. The third folder held a property deed. The 31 acres out past the county line, where I used to pick wild blackberries along the fence line every August, had been sold in 2018 for $185,000. The proceeds went into a personal account in my father's name. No family meeting. No mention, ever, in 12 years of holidays and dinners and small talk. I looked at my grandmother. She sat with her back straight, both feet flat on the floor, hands folded in her lap the way she used to sit behind the teller counter, waiting for the next customer's number to be called. "I found the discrepancy in 2017, she said. 2 years after your grandfather passed. I was going through old statements the way I always did, and the numbers didn't sit right. So I kept looking. Why didn't you say something then? I'd just had my hip replaced, sweetheart. I couldn't drive myself anywhere for 4 months. Your father was the one taking me to physical therapy twice a week." She paused. "You don't accuse the man carrying your groceries up the stairs." Then she looked at me, and her eyes were dry and steady. "Now I can carry my own groceries. And they threw that girl a party for 150 people and didn't save you a seat. And you still mailed her a card. That card, the one I wrote standing at a drugstore counter with a pen that kept skipping. That was the thing that finally made my 84-year-old grandmother decide it was time." I drove home with the folders on the passenger seat, where the cookie tin had been. The September light low and gold through the windshield. I didn't turn on the radio. I sat in my driveway with the engine off until Biscuit appeared in the front window, tail going, unaware that anything in the world had shifted. Inside, I spread the papers across my kitchen table. Biscuit rested his chin on the edge of it, warm and uncomfortable, understanding nothing about estate law, and everything about being present. I got out the same graph paper notebook I used to track monthly reconciliations at work, and I made a list, not of what I felt, but of what I knew. That's the trick to holding steady when the ground moves. You separate the diagnosis from the emotion. You read the numbers. You identify the fracture. Then you make a plan. At the bottom of the third folder, my grandmother had paperclipped a single line, written on the back of a grocery receipt. "Call Ed Marsh. He wrote the original. He'll know what to do." Below it, a phone number in her neat blue ink. Ed Marsh's office was a converted garage behind his house, insulated with plywood and lined with filing cabinets. A green banker's lamp on the desk, and a framed photo on the wall of him and my grandfather, holding up a lake trout the length of a toddler's arm. He was 71, technically retired, which for Ed meant he'd stopped billing hourly and started only taking clients he actually cared about. He'd cared about my grandfather a great deal. "Sit," he said when I walked in, nodding at the folders under my arm. "Doris called me last week. Told me you'd be coming." Of course she had. He read through everything without hurrying. The way a man reads when he already suspects what he's going to find, and is bracing for it to be worse than he expected. "I wrote this will," he said, tapping the original. "Walter came to me in the spring of 2011, sat right there." He nodded at the chair I was in. Said, "I want Nora taken care of. She's the one who never asks." He took his glasses off. "This second version, I never touched it. Your father used someone in the city. Can we do anything about it? The clock on contesting an estate starts when the beneficiary knew or should have known about the fraud," he said. "You were 22 when your grandfather died, away at school, and your father was sole executor. You were never notified of the amendment." He looked at me over the desk. "The clock hasn't started, Nora. You're still well inside the window." He laid out a plan. He'd send my father a certified letter requesting a full accounting of the estate. At the same time, he'd invite the family to what he called an estate review, not a courtroom, just his garage office, a green lamp, and a photo of a fish that got away from him 20 years ago. "Bring everyone who has standing," he said. "Your father, your mother, your sister, your aunt, anyone connected to Walter's estate." 5 days later, I was cleaning out a stockroom shelving unit at work when my phone buzzed. The screen said Dad. He hadn't called me in 3 months. Not since he'd asked me to pick up a prescription for my mother while she was working a double. "We need to talk," he said. His voice had the same flat control he used with clients, whose loan applications came back flagged, controlled. But you could hear the effort underneath it, like a pipe humming right before the pressure blows. "As a family, This weekend, okay, Dad, I said. The same flat 2 words I'd said to my grandmother 3 weeks earlier. Same tone, entirely different weight behind it. He hung up without saying goodbye. 30 minutes later my mother called, her voice thin with confusion. Honey, what's going on? Your father's been in his office with the door shut for an hour. Ask Dad, Mom. I'm asking you. This one has to come from him. I paused. Are you doing okay? I will be, I said, and for once I meant it as a promise instead of a reflex. At Marcia's office, Saturday, 10 a.m. everyone. That night my father called again, 9:30, ice shifting audibly in a glass somewhere behind his voice. Can we handle this privately? Just the two of us. I can explain everything. Ed's office, Saturday, 10. Everyone, I repeated, and hung up. He didn't wait for Saturday. 2 nights before the meeting, he invited the 4 of us, him, my mother, Paige, and me, to dinner. He did not invite my grandmother, and I noticed that the same way I now noticed everything, quietly, with a number attached. My mother made a roast. There was a tablecloth on the table, unusual for a weeknight, and the good dishes, unusual for anything that wasn't a holiday. My father waited until everyone's plate was full before he spoke. There's been some confusion about your grandfather's estate, he said, looking at me and not at anyone else. I handled everything years ago, properly, and now somebody's stirring things up that don't need stirring. Paige set her fork down. Why are we talking about Grandpa's estate? He's been gone 10 years. My father kept his eyes on me. Your grandmother's getting older, Nora. These papers she's shown you, they're outdated. They don't reflect what was actually finalized. I took a bite of the roast, chewed, swallowed, took a sip of water. Saturday, I said. Ed's office. Bring whatever you want to bring. Nora, the roast is really good, Mom. Nobody moved for what felt like a full minute. Then I stood, carried my plate to the sink, rinsed it, set it in the drying rack, and said, thank you for dinner. I'll see everyone Saturday, from the doorway. And I drove home in the first real cold snap of the season, with the heater running and the folders sitting untouched on my passenger seat, because I'd learned something from my grandmother. You don't show your hand at the wrong table. Before we get to Saturday, if you've ever had to sit across from someone you love, and hold your ground anyway, I want you to know that's not coldness. That's survival. Drop a heart in the comments if you've been there, and let's keep going. Because it's about to get harder before it gets easier. My Aunt Denise called me Friday morning. Denise is my father's younger sister. A retired physical therapist who lives 15 minutes from Doris and checks on her 3 times a week. Your father went to see your grandmother yesterday, she said, no greeting, straight to the number that mattered. Exactly like the rest of the women in this family. 2 hours. I made myself scarce in the kitchen. When he came out, his face was the color of a stop sign, and he wouldn't look at me. Your grandmother hadn't moved from her chair. She asked me if I wanted a cookie. I could picture it exactly, my grandmother in her chair, spine straight, hands folded, watching her son try to convince an 84-year-old former bank manager that she'd misremembered her own numbers. What did he say to her? That she was confused. That the old papers didn't mean what she thought. Denise paused. She told him she could recite every line item of that estate from memory. Then she asked him what happened to the strip mall investment in 2016. He didn't answer that one. That evening my grandmother told me the same story in 3 fewer words. I've been okay for 84 years, she said. Your father isn't going to undo that in one afternoon. My mother called next, and she sounded different, not confused anymore, rattled. Your father says your grandmother needs to see a doctor. He says she might be showing signs of decline, and he wants to schedule an evaluation. I let 3 seconds of silence sit there before I answered. Mom, has Grandma ever once in your life gotten a number wrong? Silence. No, she said finally, quieter than I'd heard her in years. Then maybe ask yourself why Dad suddenly thinks she can't count. The night before the meeting, I lay on my couch with biscuits, head heavy across my lap. The apartment quiet, except for the hum of the refrigerator and the occasional car passing outside, its headlights dragging slow rectangles of light across the ceiling. I thought about calling Ed and telling him I'd changed my mind. I thought about calling my father and saying, "Forget it. Keep the money, keep the land, keep the version of the story you've been telling yourself for 12 years. I thought about how much simpler it would be to go back to being the daughter who never needed anything from anyone. Because here's the part nobody warns you about when you finally decide to stand up for yourself. It isn't the anger that's hardest to carry. It's the doubt that shows up the night before, in the dark, when a small voice asks whether you're the one about to tear the family apart." My grandfather used to say something I didn't understand until that night. He'd say it whenever a storm was coming and the yard needed clearing and nobody wanted to go out in the wind. "The truth doesn't break a family," he'd say. "The lie already did. The truth just shows you where the crack was." At 11 that night my phone lit up. Paige, my sister, almost never calls. She texts short messages or forwards me a photo of an event she styled. Calls are for emergencies or Christmas. Nora, her voice sounded younger than 12. "Did Dad really change Grandpa's will?" "Come to Ed's office tomorrow," I said. "You'll see everything." I didn't know. I swear I didn't know. She was crying quietly, the kind that barely makes it past the throat. I thought he was just taking care of both of us equally. "I know you didn't know, Paige. Are you angry at me?" "No," I said. "That's exactly why I'm not angry at you." I woke before dawn, fed biscuit, made coffee in a dark kitchen, because the gray light through the window was enough, and I didn't want to disturb the quiet. I dressed carefully, not fancy, not casual. The navy blazer I wore to my first interview at the hardware chain 7 years ago, pressed slacks. The outfit of a woman who came to be taken seriously and intended to leave the same way. I got to Ed's garage office an hour early, because arriving early is what you learn to do when you've spent a lifetime being the one nobody waits for. He'd arranged 6 chairs in a loose half circle around his desk. 2 folders laid out, a pitcher of water and a stack of paper cups. No flowers. No pretense that this was a casual visit. "You ready?" he asked. "No," I said. "But that's never stopped me before." He smiled the first time I'd seen it, and it looked exactly like my grandfather's smile in the photo on the wall. Crooked, brief, a little sad around the edges. At 9:47, I heard gravel shift under tires in the lot. I didn't need to turn around to know it was my father's car. I'd been hearing that engine pull into driveways my whole life, and it had never once sounded as loud as it did that morning. He came in first, wearing the charcoal suit he wore to client meetings and funerals, freshly shaved, jaw tight. He nodded at Ed the way men nod when neither wants to be the first to speak. My mother came in behind him, eyes swollen not from that morning, but from days of crying that had only recently let up. She sat in the chair farthest from my father, something I had never once seen her do. Paige came last, slipping in like someone unsure they belonged, choosing the chair by the filing cabinet, hands pressed between her knees. Then the door opened again, and my Aunt Denise walked in with my Uncle Gary behind her. My father clearly hadn't expected them. "If this concerns my father's estate," Denise said, pulling a chair from the wall, "I have a right to be here." Gary too. Gary, a retired electrician who rarely said more than 10 words in a room, nodded once and sat, and his presence alone seemed to take up a third of the oxygen in that small office. The door opened one final time. Denise carried something with her, a manila envelope sealed with masking tape. My grandmother's handwriting across the front. To be opened in front of everyone. My father's eyes landed on it and stayed there a beat too long. "Mom sent something." "She did," Denise said. Ed stood. He didn't clear his throat, didn't tap his pen, didn't do any of the things people do to stall for courage. He simply stood, and the room went still. "I called this meeting to review irregularities in the estate of Walter Whitlock, deceased 2014, he said. "Everything I'm about to walk through is documented. When I'm finished, everyone will have the chance to respond." My father sat straighter. He was a man who sold financial protection for a living. He knew exactly what documented meant, and for the first time in 12 years, there was no client to defer to, no phone call to reschedule, no version of the story he could redirect. Ed laid the 2 wills side by side, facing outward so everyone could read them. This is the will Walter executed in my office in 2011, witnessed and notarized. It names Nora Whitlock as primary beneficiary of the majority of his estate, the rental property, the acreage past the county line, and his full credit union savings. He moved to the second page. This is the version filed with the county after Walter's death, prepared by a different attorney, splitting the estate 55% to Richard, 25% to Paige. 22 Nora, held in a trust managed by Richard. My mother leaned forward. I've never seen the first one in my life. My father said nothing. Ed opened the second folder. Bank statements. Every withdrawal marked in yellow. The balance draining from $160,000 down to zero across 18 months. Every signature the same. Then the deed, 31 acres sold for $185,000. Proceeds routed into a personal account. No family notified, ever. The original will, Ed said, named Nora as primary beneficiary of approximately $245,000 in combined assets. The amended version redirected those assets without her knowledge or consent. My father's voice came out flat, rehearsed. This was my father's estate. I had a right to manage it. Ed looked at him over his glasses, his tone never rising. You had a right to manage it, Richard. Not to take it? Nobody breathed for a long moment. Then Ed reached for the taped envelope and opened it carefully. The way you open something from a person who took real care in preparing it. Inside sat a handwritten letter and a single photocopied document. He read the letter aloud, and though it was his voice, the rhythm belonged entirely to my grandmother, measured, precise, unwilling to waste a single word. To my family. I've stayed quiet for 12 years. Not out of weakness, but out of preparation. Richard, you're my son and I love you. But you took from your daughter what your father wanted her to have. I can't undo what you did, but I can make sure the record is finally complete. I won't be there in person today, because my body doesn't always cooperate anymore. But my memory does, and my memory has a better record than some people's honesty. Denise let out a sound halfway between a laugh and a sob. Gary put a hand on her shoulder. Ed lifted the second document. This is a life insurance policy your father took out in 2010, through a credit union he had no connection to. Beneficiary, Nora Whitlock. Death benefit, $60,000. Never claimed. My father looked up, genuinely startled. I didn't know that existed. No, Ed said. Because your mother opened it herself, specifically at an institution where you had no signing authority. She didn't fully trust what might happen to your father's money once he was gone. Turns out she wasn't wrong. The room absorbed what that meant, that my 84-year-old grandmother, recovering from hip surgery, dependent on her son for rides to physical therapy, had been quietly building a second set of books for over a decade, in a drawer nobody thought to open, waiting for the day the numbers would need to be read aloud. My father unknotted his tie with shaking hands and set it on the desk, coiled like a question nobody wanted to answer. I made a mistake, he said, his voice cracking on the second word, not dramatically. Just a hairline fracture that told you the foundation had been shifting for years, and this was the first time it showed on the surface. I thought I could grow it. There was a development opportunity in 2016. I put $140,000 into it. It collapsed 18 months later. I sold the land to try to recover the loss. That failed too. And I didn't know how to say any of it out loud. He looked at me. I told myself you didn't need it. You had your job, your apartment, your own life. You were always fine. His eyes were wet, and I let myself believe that meant you didn't need what was actually yours. I looked at my father, not the insurance agent, not the man who forgot to co-sign my lease, but the man who taught me to ride a bike in a church parking lot, one hand on the seat, waving with the other when he finally let go. For one long, airless moment, I thought about letting the whole thing drop. Maybe peace was worth more than $245,000. Then I thought about the vineyard. 150 guests, and no seat saved for me. I believe you're sorry, I said. I believe you were scared. But you didn't just take money, Dad. You took 12 years where I genuinely believed this family didn't think I was worth including. Every party I wasn't invited to. Every trip I found out about after the fact. Every time Mom said the venue ran out of room, you let that happen. Because including me meant looking at me and remembering what you'd done. The room went completely silent. My mother was crying. Denise was watching my father with an expression somewhere between pity and fury. You didn't just take an inheritance, I said. You took the story of who I was allowed to be in this family. You turned me into the daughter who didn't need anything. Because needing something from you would have meant admitting what you owed me. And I believed the story. For 12 years, I believed it. Paige's shoulders were shaking, her head down. I hadn't raised my voice once. I'd spoken the way my grandmother speaks. Flat, factual. The weight carried entirely by the content, none of it by volume. Ed laid out 3 options. The way he'd laid out everything else. Neat, orderly, no ambiguity. Formal legal action. A mediated settlement with documented repayment, or a family agreement he'd draft himself, signed by everyone present. I don't want to sue my father, I said, looking at my dad, who was staring at his own hands. But I want every cent of it accounted for, in writing. With a repayment schedule, he looked back at me, like he was actually seeing me, not the easy one. Not the fine one for the first time in over a decade. If you've ever sat at a family table where your chair felt borrowed from another room, you already understand what it takes to stop being an afterthought. I'm not telling you this story to punish anyone. I'm telling you because sometimes the only way to finally be seen is to stop making yourself easy to overlook. If this is hitting close to home, drop a comment below. I read every single one. And if you haven't yet, this is a good moment to hit subscribe. Because these stories aren't going anywhere, and neither are we. My mother spoke next, wiping her face with the heel of her hand, not bothering with the tissue anymore. You told me she didn't want to come to the party, she said to my father, her voice low and cracked. You said she was busy. You said she preferred being alone. He opened his mouth and closed it again. How many times did you tell me that, Richard? I asked her to drive Paige 8 hours to that program and she did it without a single complaint. I asked her to come to every holiday and she came, every year, and sat at the end of the table, and never once said a word. Her voice broke fully. And every time I said we ran out of room, it was because you told me she wouldn't mind. She turned to me, mascara streaked in 2 dark lines she didn't bother wiping. I believed him every time, because it was easier than calling you myself and asking directly. I am so sorry, Nora. I know, Mom, I said. From now on, ask me. Not through Dad, not through Paige. Call me directly, and listen to what I actually say. Denise nodded slowly. I think we all should have been doing that a long time ago. Gary, who hadn't spoken a single word the entire meeting, looked at my father and said, in a voice like gravel settling, Walter would have hated watching this. Then he looked at me. But he'd have been proud of you for making it happen. Ed had the agreement drafted before we ever walked in, because he'd told me he would. And he had 4 pages, plain language, no jargon. Written the way my grandmother would have written it herself. Specific, numbered, impossible to misread. My father would repay $280,000 total, the original inheritance, plus accrued interest across 7 years. In monthly, documented payments, reviewed quarterly by an independent accountant. 3 missed payments in a row would restore my right to pursue full civil action. The $60,000 life insurance policy would be claimed immediately, forms already prepared, and as partial compensation for land that could never be returned. My father would sign over ownership of my grandmother's house on Cedar Ridge, effective the day she passed. Ed set the agreement down. Then he set something else beside it. My grandfather's old fountain pen, initials engraved on the barrel, the one he'd used to sign the original will, kept in Ed's desk drawer for over a decade. This was Walter's, Ed said. Seems fitting. My father's hand shook as he picked it up. Not from cold, not from fear exactly. But the way a hand shakes when the body is finally catching up to something the mind avoided for years. He signed. My mother watched him sign. Paige watched him sign. Denise and Gary watched him sign. And then I reached into my bag and set the cookie tin on the desk. Beside the legal documents and the folders, my grandmother's molasses cookies, baked at 5 that morning by weight instead of volume. Because weight, she always said, doesn't lie. We sat in that converted garage eating cookies and signing paperwork. And for the first time in over a decade, every number in my family's ledger finally matched. They left one at a time. Paige first, without a word to our father, though she squeezed my shoulder on her way past. My mother next, driving separately from my father for what might have been the first time I could ever remember. Denise and Gary together, Gary's hand steady at her back, Denise carrying the last of the cookies wrapped in a napkin. My father was the last to stand. He looked at Ed, then at me, opened his mouth, closed it, and walked out. The gravel crunched slow and uneven under his shoes. A man walking a road he no longer entirely recognized. Ed gathered the folders into the filing cabinet with the quiet efficiency of a man who'd done this kind of work for 40 years and understood exactly when the ceremony ended and the paperwork began. "Your grandfather would be proud of you," he said. "He'd be sad it was ever necessary, but he planned for it anyway," I said. That's exactly the kind of man he was. He told me something that I still carry. He said my grandfather used to talk about me constantly in his last years, on the drive to the hardware store, out on the porch in the evenings. He'd say I was the only one in the family who understood the difference between being strong and being stubborn. Stubborn people hold on to everything. Strong people know exactly what they have to let go of. I drove home past the field where the acreage used to be. Someone had built a small gas station on it, 2 pumps and a convenience store, selling lottery tickets and beef jerky. I pulled in, filled my tank, bought a pack of gum. The receipt cost more than my grandfather's fountain pen was worth in dollars. But the pen was worth infinitely more than the field ever had been. I went to see my grandmother that afternoon. The hydrangeas along her walk were still holding their color despite the early cold snap. "Did he sign?" she asked before I'd made it up the front steps. "He signed." She took a slow sip of her tea and nodded once, satisfied the way she used to look when a ledger finally balanced to the penny. I told her everything, the room, the documents, the letter read aloud. My father's face when the insurance policy surfaced, my mother's tears, Paige's silence, Gary's few gravel-voiced words. My grandmother listened the way she always listened. No interruptions, no performative nodding, none of the small noises people make when they're more invested in appearing to listen than in actually hearing you. When I finished, she closed her eyes for a long moment. "I didn't want to hurt him," she said. "I wanted him to stop hurting you." "There's a difference." "I know, Grandma. He cried when he was 9 and broke my kitchen window with a baseball too," she said. "Crying doesn't mean a person's wrong to pay for what they broke." I told her about the settlement, and she asked what I planned to do with the insurance money. "Fix your roof," I said. "It's been leaking since the spring." She laughed a real laugh, the kind that showed her back teeth and shook her whole frame. I hadn't heard that sound from her in years. "Your grandfather always said you'd end up fixing things," she said. "He just never guessed you'd have to fix the whole family first." 6 months later, the payments started arriving on time. Every one of them a physical check in an envelope with a printed return address, even though a bank transfer would have taken my father 30 seconds to set up. I never asked why he chose paper. I think I already knew. Some debts need the weight of an actual pen behind them. He got quieter at family gatherings. Not absent, he came to everything. Thanksgiving, Christmas, Paige's actual wedding the following spring, where every guest list had my name on it in ink. No exceptions, no headcount excuses. He brought dessert to every gathering. Always something about set on the table without ceremony. And he stopped trying to steer every conversation the way he used to. My mother started calling every Sunday evening. Small questions that didn't seem like much on their own. "How's Biscuit? How's work? Read anything good lately?" The kind of questions that add up over time the same way pennies do, if you stop throwing them away. 3 months after that meeting, Paige mailed me a card she'd made herself. A watercolor of a dog on the front that looked suspiciously like Biscuit. And inside, in her own handwriting, "I'm sorry I never noticed before. I'm learning to now." I pinned it to my fridge next to a photo of my grandfather holding that enormous lake trout, and a photo of my grandmother on her porch, tea in hand, sun on her face. I used part of the insurance money to fix Grandma's roof, 3 days of work, new shingles, new flashing around the chimney. Part of it went toward a used truck, since my old sedan had started burning oil on hills. And I gave $5,000 to the shelter where I'd adopted Biscuit. Because some debts are owed to the places that gave you something you needed before you even knew to ask for it. I never got a party with 150 guests. What I got instead was something a lot harder to fake, a family that finally counted me in the room. A few weeks after the roof was finished, I was helping my grandmother reorganize her front room. She'd decided to move her bedroom downstairs, since the staircase had gotten harder on her hip, and she was practical enough to say so before anyone had to bring it up first. We spent an afternoon arguing about where the bookshelf should go. She wanted it by the window. I wanted it against the interior wall because the window let in a draft every February. She won, she always did. In the bottom drawer of her writing desk, beneath a stack of old church bulletins, I found a second ledger. Not a financial one, not the kind she kept during her banking career. This one was small, cloth-bound, the green cover gone soft at the corners from years of handling. I opened it. The first entries went back to when I was 7 years old, dates, and beside each one, a short note, none of it about money, all of it about me. Nora fixed the porch light. No one asked her to. Nora drove me to my eye appointment, brought cookies. Nora mailed Paige's birthday card a day early, even after everything. Nora called on Sunday, asked about the garden. Nora came to Thanksgiving, sat at the end of the table, stayed to do the dishes. Page after page. The final 2 pages carried handwriting that had gone slightly shakier, but was still unmistakably hers, a list titled, in her careful blue ink, Things Nora Has Done Without Ever Being Asked, and at the very bottom, in red ink, the only red ink in the entire book, underlined once, she never asked for a single thing. That is exactly why she deserved everything. I closed the ledger and put it back exactly where I found it, because it wasn't mine to keep. Some records belong to the person who kept them. Then I walked out to the porch and sat in the chair that used to be my grandfather's. The hydrangeas were still blooming, the roof no longer leaked, and somewhere inside the house, I could hear my grandmother humming the same tune she used to hum, while teaching me to count coins at her kitchen table. Quarters first, then dimes, then nickels, pennies last. Because pennies were the ones people threw away without thinking twice. If you're still here with me, thank you. This one came from somewhere I don't visit often on this channel, but I think a lot of you already know this particular room. If you spent years being the daughter who was just so easy, the one nobody thought to check on because you never gave them a reason to worry, I see you. You matter. Your name belongs on somebody's list too. If this story meant something to you tonight, leave a comment and let me know which part hit hardest. Share it with a woman in your life who spent too long holding things together alone. And check the description below for more stories just like this one. This has been her side of the story for every woman who held it together alone. I'll see you in the next one.